In this video, we're going to start looking at program components as we start to build our own programs from scratch. And you'll start to better familiarize yourselves with some of the different options that are available in the program tree, even for the built-in Halion programs. Now, I'm going to get started here by clearing out the programs on our slot rack by clicking on the trash icon up above. It's going to ask if we want to clear. We'll go ahead and clear it. And then I'm going to come up in the slot rack, and then we're going to view the empty slots. This will give us access to all of our empty slots and help us get a fresh start here. Now, one thing you'll notice is that even though we've cleared our slots on our programs, that some of those elements from the previous program we had loaded remain in the program tree. But these aren't really going to get in the way of what we're doing. The easiest way to get started building the most basic of programs is by loading the initialize program. We can do that from the media bay, or we can just click this down arrow, which will open up our program load dialog. This is essentially the same as what we're looking at in the media bay here. It's just an alternative view of that, so you could essentially do this in the media bay. What you're going to type into the search field is init, which stands for initialize. You'll see several different components here, but the one you're going to load is the one that says init program. So we'll just double click on it, and it loads it up into our program slot. You'll see now that our program tree has reset and given us the most basic elements of what makes up a program. If we play a few keys on our keyboard, you'll just hear some basic tones coming through. Every sound in Halion comes from one of the lowest level components that we have, and it's called a zone. Now, the term zone is used quite often throughout Halion, but in terms of creating sound, there's 5 different types of zones. So we'll just select the synth zone here, and then we'll come over to the sound tab. This reveals the synthesizer settings. We can change the type of zones by clicking on the down arrow in the synth zone icon. This allows us to change between the 5 different sound generating zones. So we can change it to a sampler, a grain table synthesizer, a drawbar organ synthesizer, and also a wavetable synthesizer. Those are the 5 most basic sound generating components that are available in Halion. So if we're using a wavetable synth, we can change the wavetable and choose between several different waveform types. So we'll just go through the menu here, select a new waveform. We'll just double click on it to load it. And of course, we have all of the settings that affect that synthesizer. Let's just change the coarse pitch adjustment of this waveform. Let's create a new zone for this layer, first by removing the old zone. So we'll right click on it and choose delete. We can add new zones to a layer in Halion by right-clicking any layer within our program, coming down to New, choosing Zone, and then selecting the type of zone we want to create. And that zone gets added to the bottom level of our layer. Now, to stay organized, I like to label the layers so that I know what's going on if I decide to save this program and recall it at a later time. To rename, just right-click the layer name and choose Rename. We'll label this Synth 1. Now, you'll also notice several other components contained within that program's layers. You'll see we have the flex phraser, which is essentially just an arpeggiator. So if we want to enable the flex phraser for a given synthesizer, you can choose the flex phraser, click the activate button, and the arpeggiator becomes active. You can select between a number of presets for the flex phraser that come with Halion. Let's select the Synth Arp 7 preset. And each flex phraser comes with 8 arpeggiators. So let's click on number 2 and load a different preset. We'll try one of these chord presets. Then we can easily change between the different arpeggiator types. Let's come over to number 3, and this time we'll activate the user button, which allows us to create our own arpeggiator types by using the flex phraser controls. So we can click and drag this blue arrow and define the number of steps that we want the arpeggiator to have in its sequence. Clicking and dragging our mouse will let us draw in a new arpeggiator sequence. In this case, the arpeggiator is affecting our velocity, which we can see by the highlighted blue button on the left. We can even transpose individual steps by clicking and dragging our mouse for each step. This transposes each step in halftones. And you also have different functions for the arpeggiator here. Now, the one thing to understand about the components in the program tree is that this flex phraser isn't necessarily a part of our synthesizer. The flex phraser, we can see, has a MIDI icon, so it's actually transforming the MIDI that's coming in from our MIDI keyboard and then sending it to this synthesizer. So even if we change the zone type, say over to the wavetable or sampler, and load a preset, those same phrases that we've built in the flex phraser will apply to that new synthesizer. And the same goes for these LFO components. The LFO components are LFOs that generate a MIDI signal to send to our synthesizer. So these MIDI LFOs are different from the LFO that is in our synthesizer. So the other thing you may have noticed is that our signal flow goes from top to bottom, but it's also within the realm of these indented areas. So starting with this layer, it moves from top to bottom, but only within the layer. Now, each layer can also have multiple zones. So we can easily add another zone by right-clicking the layer, coming down to New, choosing Zone, and then selecting the zone type. This time, when we send MIDI into Halion, both zones will be activated at the same time, but it's all within the realm of this layer. So essentially, any component in the upper level of the layer is going to be sending its information into both zones simultaneously. Let's come in here and slightly change the pitch so that it's a little more obvious. Come up here to our fine pitch adjustment. We'll put it just slightly out of tune. Should get a chorusing effect. Now, each program can also have up to 4 layers. Each layer can contain their own flex phrasers, zones, mix channels, effects, etc. This time, we'll right-click on the root level of our program, and we'll create a new layer. We'll label this Sampler. Now, notice that we don't have anything in this layer, so we need to add zones to that layer by right-clicking, choosing New, Zone. This time we'll choose a sample zone. Additionally, if we wanted to add any of those extra MIDI modules like the flex phrasers or LFOs, we could right-click that layer, come to New, MIDI module, and you'll see a wide array of all sorts of modules to pick from. You can see there's quite a few things that are available to us. So under Player, we'll choose Flex Phraser. And now we have a completely independent flex phraser for our sampler layer. Let's click on the sampler zone and we'll load a sample. So click the Load Replace Sample button and you can navigate your hard drive to locate a sample. In this case, we'll choose a hi-hat sample. We'll click Open. You can see the sample here. And this sampler works just like any other sampler. So you can set the start and end times for the sample. You can change the playback mode. So if you want to reverse it or turn it into a one-shot, if it was drum sample, you could easily do that. You can set the loop region for sustaining sample. The sampler also has several pitch stretch modes, which you can use to adjust the way that it does pitch shifting, and other common features like filters, envelopes, LFOs, and a step sequencer modulator with a built-in modulation matrix. The main thing to get from this is when you're creating your own sounds, just pay particular attention to the hierarchy in the program tree and stay organized by labeling your layers and keeping everything somewhat self-contained. Now, to save this as a program, we first have to give it a name. So we'll just right-click, we'll choose Rename. This is on the root level of our program here. Silly Sequence. Then we can click the Save Program button. This will open up the familiar Save dialog. It should automatically title it the name of your program. So if you haven't labeled it here, you can give it a new name in the Save dialog. Set any additional attributes that you want off to the right side, such as setting a style and some of the different categories, and even giving it your own custom keywords that you can use when you search for it in the media bay. And when we click OK, it's saved. And by visiting the media bay, we can easily find it by using those attributes that we have set. So if we filter it out for hi-hats in the subcategory, we'll see that it saved it with that attribute. In the next video, we're going to start to take a look at some of the busing architecture and show you how you can set up different mix layers for each program.